Hey guys, tonight's history journey is going to be a little furry, a little feathery, and occasionally tusky. So, go ahead, dim the lights, grab a blanket, maybe sip on some chamomile tea if you're feeling fancy. And let's wander back to a time when kings and queens didn't just demand gold, jewels, or endless banquets. They also demanded animals. Lots of animals. Not as pets, mind you, but as props, as entertainers. Because if you're an ancient ruler with absolute power, why not force a lion to juggle or a monkey to dance, right? Now, it might surprise you, or maybe not, that humans have been dragging animals into their royal entertainment schemes for thousands of years. Some of these stories are amusing, some are tragic, and many are just plain weird. But they do give us a clear picture. If you were an exotic animal in the ancient world, your fate was pretty much decided by whether or not some king thought you looked funny when wearing a golden collar. Let's start somewhere familiar, ancient Egypt. Yes, the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and apparently trained baboons. The Egyptians adored animals. Cats, obviously, but also crocodiles, ibises, and falcons. In fact, some pharaohs thought it was hilarious to keep monkeys as entertainers at court. These weren't just lounging around eating figs. They were trained to clap, dance, and in some cases even pour drinks. Imagine your big royal feast and a baboon waddles in with a jug of beer. Probably wasn't hygienic, but hey, it was memorable. And crocodiles, oh yes, they were part of the spectacle too. The god Sobuk was literally a crocodile, so some pharaohs kept live crocodiles as a sort of divine showpiece. It was less cute entertainment, and more look, my dinner hall has a giant reptile pit. Very cozy, very welcoming. And if that didn't impress visiting dignitaries, the Egyptians also paraded trained lions. Because nothing says Egyptian hospitality like an apex predator wandering between the dessert trays. But let's float over to ancient Rome because, of course, the Romans never did subtle. If the Egyptians had baboons and crocodiles, the Romans had basically a traveling zoo/battlefield. Emperors loved to spice up their games with exotic creatures dragged in from across the empire. Elephants, tigers, leopards, even giraffes. All put on display, all expected to perform. Sometimes this meant staged hunts in the Colosseum, where gladiators or hunters fought them for applause. Other times, animals were trained to do circus-style tricks, which, frankly, seems almost worse. One emperor, Heliogabalus, yes, the famously eccentric one, supposedly kept lions and leopards as house pets and let them roam free at banquets. Imagine trying to enjoy your wine while a leopard casually stares at your leg. Very relaxing, very fine dining. And Caligula, ever the charming host, once paraded his horse around dressed in jewels. He loved animals, but mainly as extensions of his own ego. His horse, Incitatus, wasn't exactly an entertainer in the juggling sense, but being fed oats mixed with gold flakes at imperial banquets. That's performance art in its own right. And then there was the Emperor Commodus. Yes, the one immortalized in Gladiator, who actually enjoyed killing exotic animals in front of crowds. He once shot arrows at hundreds of ostriches just to show off his aim. The crowd, of course, clapped politely. Not because it was entertaining, but because if you didn't clap for the emperor, you might suddenly find yourself in the arena with the ostriches. We can't leave out ancient China, though. The emperors there were no less creative in turning animals into their own Netflix specials. During the Han Dynasty, rare animals were a symbol of cosmic approval. Basically, if you owned a dancing crane or a white deer, it meant the universe liked you. So, imperial courts went to great lengths to acquire strange animals, train them, and then parade them as heavenly omens. Elephants were especially prized, lumbering through the palace as living proof that the emperor was favored by the heavens. But animals weren't just shown off. They were made to perform in choreographed court dances. Yes, imagine entire choreographies featuring humans and animals moving in rhythm. Graceful? Maybe. Awkward? Definitely. A goose trying to keep tempo with a flute isn't exactly ballet. Of course, all of this might sound amusing when told from a distance. But for the animals, life was not exactly great. Most of them were dragged from their natural habitats, forced into cold palaces or hot arenas, and turned into curiosities. But to ancient kings, this was power made visible. A ruler who could make a lion dance, or parade an elephant through the banquet hall wasn't just rich. He was, in his own mind, almost divine. And that's the quiet irony running through all of this. These rulers thought they were showing strength by turning animals into entertainers. But really, they were just showing how much free time they had, and how much everyone else had to pretend it was impressive. Alright, so we've lounged around with Egyptian baboons and sat through Roman dinner parties where lions casually circled the appetizers. Let's now float gently forward into the medieval and early modern world, where kings and queens got even more creative. Or more ridiculous, depending on how charitable you're feeling. One of the most enduring medieval traditions was the dancing bear. And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Bears were captured as cubs, chained, and then taught to dance by standing them on hot surfaces while music played. The bear would hop around to avoid burning its feet, and voila, a bear dance. Kings across Europe loved this kind of thing. It wasn't elegant, but after a few goblets of wine, it probably looked like peak entertainment. You can almost picture a king muttering, "Ah yes, this is culture." But kings didn't stop with bears. They adored the idea of having entire royal menageries, little zoos where exotic animals served as living trophies. These weren't really meant for conservation, obviously. They were more like the ultimate, look how powerful I am, flex. For example, Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire kept an elephant, leopards, camels, and even cheetahs. He loved showing them off at courtly gatherings. Because nothing says God's chosen emperor like a cheetah sulking in the corner while knights try to politely clap. And speaking of cheetahs, medieval rulers really leaned into the idea of turning them into hunting companions, especially in India and the Islamic courts, where cheetahs were trained for royal hunts. They were basically seen as status symbols with claws. The Mughal emperors in particular were obsessed. Akbar the Great supposedly owned over 1,000 trained cheetahs at one point. Imagine the feeding bill. And of course, the cheetahs weren't just for hunting. They were paraded in jeweled collars, lounging like oversized house cats while courtiers whispered about how divine the emperor must be to command them. Meanwhile, in England, monarchs were building their own bizarre animal collections. The Tower of London didn't just hold prisoners. It held a royal menagerie that included lions, leopards, monkeys, and, at one point, even a polar bear. This polar bear was a gift from the King of Norway to Henry III in the 13th century. Naturally, it was chained up by the Thames River and allowed to swim and catch fish. Imagine strolling past the tower in medieval London and casually seeing a polar bear fishing in the river. Not terrifying at all. Very casual. And the gifting of animals between rulers became its own sort of political theater. "Oh, you brought me a tapestry? That's nice. But look, I brought you a giraffe." For instance, in 1486, Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence received a giraffe from Egypt. It became the talk of the city, until, unfortunately, it broke its neck walking under a low ceiling. Medieval architecture was not giraffe-friendly, but the message was clear. If you could get your hands on a giraffe, you were basically untouchable. Let's not forget the French kings, who also adored their animal spectacles. At Versailles, exotic animals were paraded through the gardens like moving jewels. Louis XIV, the Sun King, loved staging grand hunts where deer and boars were herded directly into the path of courtiers. And in quieter moments, monkeys dressed in tiny outfits provided comic relief. Because nothing says absolute monarchy like laughing at a monkey in a doublet while you eat another roast pheasant. Even smaller animals weren't safe from being turned into party tricks. Frogs, birds, and even trained mice made appearances in courts. Renaissance banquets often featured sugar sculptures that contained live birds inside. Guests would cut into the dessert, only for doves or sparrows to fly out, flapping frantically while everyone clapped politely. The birds probably didn't appreciate being hidden inside a pie, but for the diners, it was magical. And all of this comes back to one simple truth. For rulers, animals were never just animals. They were props. They were living symbols of wealth, divine favor, or just something to distract the guests when the harpist wasn't cutting it. Kings and queens looked at animals and thought, how can this creature make me look more powerful? Sometimes that meant chaining a bear to a post and making it stumble around to a drumbeat. Other times, it meant dangling a jeweled collar on a cheetah and pretending it was your best friend. It's both absurd and a little sad. But it's also very human, because behind the velvet robes and the golden crowns, ancient and medieval rulers were just people desperately trying to keep everyone entertained, and themselves from being bored. And what better way to kill time than with a juggling monkey or a giraffe that doesn't fit through the door? So, we've sat through baboon bartenders in Egypt, Roman leopards at dinner, and medieval dancing bears. Let's slowly glide now into the early modern courts, where kings and queens refined animal entertainment into something halfway between a circus and a diplomatic power move. Take Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. He didn't just build Versailles to show off mirrors and fountains. He also turned the place into one of Europe's most over-the-top animal showcases. Versailles had formal gardens, opera performances, and, naturally, exotic animal parades. Guests could stroll through carefully manicured paths and casually bump into camels, ostriches, or even an elephant. It was all very theatrical. Louis wanted everyone to see that even nature itself bent to his glittery will. And if that meant forcing a giraffe to wander around a hedge maze while powdered nobles giggled, so be it. Animals at Versailles weren't just background decoration either. They became stars in staged hunts. Deer and wild boar were driven into carefully controlled hunts so courtiers could show off their bravery. But don't worry, nobody important was ever in danger. The animals were placed exactly where they needed to be, and the king usually got the first kill. It was less sport and more performance art, hunting as theater. Across the channel, the English kings were still clinging to their tower menagerie. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the collection had become a full-blown tourist attraction. Lions, leopards, monkeys, and that famous polar bear were trotted out for royal entertainment and then shown off to visiting dignitaries. The irony, of course, is that these animals were supposed to represent power, but most of them looked miserable in their cages. Still, the message was clear. England could bring the wild world under lock and key. Literally. And then there's Catherine the Great of Russia, who had a well-known fondness for animals. She adored dogs and kept dozens at court, many dressed up and treated better than half the nobility. But she also loved the spectacle of exotic beasts. Lions and camels appeared in her parades, while bears remained a sort of national mascot, often trained to perform tricks at noble banquets. Nothing like a juggling bear to liven up the caviar service. Elsewhere in Europe, gifting rare animals remained the ultimate royal flex. In 1827, Muhammad Ali of Egypt sent a giraffe to France for King Charles X. This giraffe caused such a sensation that Parisians flocked to see her, sketch her, and write songs about her. She was paraded through the city streets with a custom-made coat for the colder weather. Essentially, she was the Beyoncé of giraffes. And once again, the actual animal's comfort wasn't really the priority. The point was that a king could summon an exotic creature from across the world, and everyone had to clap. By the 18th and 19th centuries, though, attitudes toward animal entertainment slowly began to shift. Enlightenment thinkers started asking awkward questions like, is chaining up a bear for laughs really noble? Spoiler, no. Slowly, royal menageries turned into public zoos, more about education, and slightly less about spectacle. The Tower of London Menagerie, for instance, was eventually closed, with animals moved to the newly founded London Zoo in the 1820s. But the royal obsession with animals never fully disappeared. Even as menageries faded, rulers kept using animals in more civilized performances. Horses became the stars of elaborate riding schools, elephants appeared in state parades, and royal pets were still treated as symbols of status. Queen Victoria's spaniels, for example, were painted more often than most members of her extended family. Looking back, the whole saga has a dreamlike quality. Ancient kings using lions as banquet props, medieval monarchs giggling at dancing bears, and modern courts parading giraffes in custom jackets. It's funny, it's tragic, and it's very, very human. Because if you strip away the crowns and palaces, the kings and queens of history were just bored people looking for a good show. And unfortunately for the animals, they didn't really get a choice in the matter. So next time your cat knocks a glass off the counter or your dog insists on chasing its tail, just remember, they're actually following in a long tradition of animal entertainment. Thankfully, without the jeweled collars, drumbeats, or crocodile-filled banquet halls.